Thank everyone for joining us this evening. My name is Nana Ajman. I'm president of Third World Alliance, the only multicultural organization on this campus. TWA is dedicated to promoting inclusion, multicultural diversity, and enhancing pluralism on campus and to the greater Worcester community. We strive to educate committed leaders of today through diverse efforts for a unified tomorrow. We encourage our new leaders through a variety of our programs like our Latino Caribbean Explosions, festivals, educational field trips, and our Courageous Conversation series. We are so proud to have Dr. Angela Davis here tonight as part of our Courageous Conversations series. I would like to thank the members of the planning committee, which includes faculty and administrators, for their support and assistance. So if I can get a hand round of applause, please. I have the honor of introducing our president, Dr. Janelle Ashley. She's the 10th president of Worcester State College and the first woman president in the college's history. She has her master's degree in English from Stephen F. Austin University and her doctorate in management from University of North Texas. Assuming the position in Worcester State College, she's been very active in local and state organizations. Most importantly, she's made a real commitment to creating a community of scholars where undergraduates are engaged in research and dialogue as we are tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Janelle Ashley.
Please join me in thanking the Third World Alliance for organizing this great event. Also, we want to thank our sponsors. Thank you so very much. I also want to thank the many friends of the college who are here with us tonight, and we are grateful for your commitment to the college. I'd now like to welcome our Director of Diversity, Edna Spencer. During her 14 years at Worcester State College, she has created a great atmosphere of dialogue on our campus, and I am so proud to have her on our team. Please welcome Edna Spencer. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Ashley. I want to do something, though, before giving the introduction. I want to recognize a couple of people who do a lot of work to bring these courageous conversation programs to our campus. Marcella Uribe Jennings. Marcella is Assistant Director of Multicultural Affairs here at Worcester State College, and Laxmi Bisandale, who is Academic Coordinator in Multicultural. Thank you for all of this. Now I have the honor and the pleasure of introducing an American icon. She is a woman who is a leader in social justice, a political activist, and a university professor who was associated with the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She was also a notable activist during the Civil Rights Movement and a prominent member and political candidate of the Communist Party, USA. She no longer identifies as a communist, but rather as a democratic socialist, and is currently a member of the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism. She first achieved nationwide notoriety when a weapon registered in her name was linked to the murder of Judge Harold Haley during an effort to free a black convict who was being tried for the attempted retaliatory murder of a white prison guard who had killed 3 unarmed black inmates. She fled underground and was the subject of an intense manhunt. She was eventually captured, arrested, tried and then acquitted in one of the most famous trials in recent U.S. history. She is currently a graduate studies professor of history of consciousness at the University of California and presidential chair at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She is dedicated to works for racial and gender equality and for gay rights and prison abolition. She is a popular public speaker nationally and internationally, as well as a founder of the grassroots prison abolition organization, Critical Resistance. Please join me, ladies and gentlemen, in welcoming a truly courageous, contemporary woman, Dr. Angela Davis.
Thank you so much, and good evening, everyone. Is anyone out there? Good evening. Great. Well, it's really good to be here once again. I traveled to Boston on January 28th, but everything was snowed in, including your college. So I ended up having to go back to California to await better weather on this coast. But let me first thank the Office of Multicultural Affairs, its director, Assistant Dean Marcella Rube Jennings, and Edna Spencer, who introduced me, who's the Director of Diversity, and the Affirmative Action Officer for your campus. And I'd also like to thank the president, whom I just had the opportunity to meet a few minutes ago, President Janelle Ashley, the student organizations, Third World Alliance, for the work that you've done to organize this event. I said I was here in Boston on January 28th, and as I prepared for this visit, I looked back at my notes for January 28th. And of course, it was barely a week after the inauguration of Barack Obama, you remember? It was shortly after the celebration of Martin Luther King Day, and many convocations were still happening during that period. We were about to observe Black History Month in February. But then, of course, I've recently seen a T-shirt that says Black History is not a month. And in the meantime, we have also observed Women's History Month. So I suppose the question is, what do we do now? Since I'm here on April 1st, I can say that I've come to talk about the glorious history and wondrous future of capitalism. I couldn't resist saying that, given the fact that this is April Fool's Day. But seriously, I want to talk about the subject that the organizers proposed to me, the state of capitalism. And more seriously, I would like to talk about the importance of developing the capacity to have deeper discussions about the socioeconomic system we call capitalism. We all know that the crisis, the economic crisis, the financial crisis we are experiencing is a crisis of capitalism, right? It's not often acknowledged as a crisis of capitalism, because many of the responses we've seen during the last months, many of the responses have assumed, it seems to me, that capitalism will be with us forever. And I know that some people have said that Barack Obama, now has the task of fixing American capitalism. What a task to force out a brother, as someone said the other day. Well, first I want to point out that far too many people assume that capitalism and democracy are synonymous. As a matter of fact, the Bush administration's so-called war on terror, isn't it amazing how rapidly George W. Bush has receded into obscurity? I think it's important to remind ourselves, where we were some months ago, this time last year, what we were talking about, the hopelessness that so many of us felt. But if you recall, the Bush administration's so-called war on terror was described so often as a war to bring democracy to the Middle East. And actually, it was a war about saving and promoting capitalism. Among other things, about oil interests in the Middle East, about an oil pipeline through Afghanistan. Over the last decade, and indeed since the 1980s, global capitalism has damaged so much of the world under the guise of producing wealth. And of course, wealth has been produced for some, but many others have been pushed into the worst poverty imaginable. And I suppose that Obama was elected in part because we were beginning to see during the election campaign the effects of a capitalist system gone mad here in the U.S. A financial crisis brought on by banks that were attempting to get greater and greater profits. The subprime mortgage crisis was really about attempting to exploit and use poor people whom so many of the banks knew would never be able to pay off those mortgages. If we look at the economic crisis now, Lawrence Summers, who is, as you know, the director of the National Economic Council, I should say parenthetically that I appreciate the people who've been appointed to these posts, but I still have a serious problem with Lawrence Summers. He was relieved of his position as president of Harvard because of his proclivity to publicly indicate that he did not think that women were capable of learning science to the same extent that men were. In this day and age, that's really problematic. But that's parenthetically. Summer said the other day that we are losing 600,000 jobs a month. 600,000 jobs a month. And I'm sure that many of you have seen the impact of this crisis. He also indicated that it's not going to stop imminently. The election campaign was really driven by hope, and that was a wonderful thing. And I think it is still important for us to be able to imagine a very different future, to hold on to that hope. But I'm afraid that it will be futile to hope that we will eventually be saved by capitalism. And as the theme of this evening's gathering indicates, capitalism does not promote justice and equality. It creates and condones injustice and inequality. As a matter of fact, historically, the African slave trade created the very basis for industrial capitalism in Europe and the United States. Read Eric Williams' wonderful study of the relationship between capitalism and slavery. As a matter of fact, the title of the book is Capitalism and Slavery. Eric Williams, who used to be Prime Minister of Trinidad. We still, as a matter of fact, live with the inequities and the racisms produced by slavery. We're still haunted by the vestiges of slavery. As a matter of fact, we still inhabit the history of slavery. We still inhabit the history of the colonization of indigenous people for capitalist profit, the usurpation of the land of Mexico, the exploitation of immigrants, European immigrants, who came to the U.S. in the 19th century looking for a new life, and instead they discovered avaricious capitalists who tried to wrench every penny of profit from them. And so I want to recall the struggles of working people, the struggles of the working class, many of which happened in this part of the country, and right here in Massachusetts. As a matter of fact, women were some of the first proletarians in the United States and created the basis for the labor movement. We don't generally acknowledge that, but I'm talking about women who worked in the mills, who made cotton, who militantly fought for the rights of workers, who fought for a shorter workday, And initially there was a struggle for the $12 day, and then the 10-hour day, and then the 8-hour day. And somehow we got stuck. I mean, I don't understand how we got stuck on the 8-hour day, because it should have continued. By now we should be at the 4-hour day. And I'm very serious about that. I'm very serious because if you look at the history of the struggle between workers and employers, between the working class and the capitalist class, it's always been a struggle over time. And working people have fought for more and more leisure time. And the capitalists have fought to have more of the day allotted to work. And of course it's very interesting because since we're talking about capitalism, maybe I can say a few words about Marxist political economy. Is that okay? One of the major contributions of Marx was to understand a contradiction, one might say an untruth at the very heart of the capitalist contract with the worker. It was always assumed that people get paid for the work that they do, right? And we say this to this very day. You know, if I make $10 an hour, say I get paid $10 for every hour I work. But as a matter of fact, as Marx pointed out, workers don't really get paid for the work that they do. They get paid for their capacity to work, for their ability to work. That is to say, they get paid what it costs to keep themselves alive in order to go to work. You see what I'm saying? And of course that's changed over time. Early on, it was basically just enough money to pay rent or buy food or whatever, but now of course you need enough to get your widescreen TV, and you need enough to get your telephone, and I forgot. I was going to use mine as a timer. And since we're talking about the fact that we need to earn enough money in order to have a cell phone, this might be a good time for people who do have cell phones to turn them off. But yes, the point that I'm making is that if the worker gets paid for his or her capacity to work, and then you subtract the value of what the worker produces during the day, or you subtract what it costs to sustain the worker, the capacity work, from the amount of work that the worker does, and you'll see that there's some extra money there. There's some extra value. Marx called it value. What Marx called it was surplus value. And that is the source of profit. That surplus value, the difference between what it costs to sustain a worker and what the worker actually produces. Now, Marx also called that exploitation. And what he argued was that exploitation wasn't really about, it's not a judgmental issue. It's not a judgment. It's not a value judgment. It is something that can be calculated. You can calculate the difference between what the worker is paid and what the worker produces, and you can come up with the rate of exploitation. And that is, in essence, what the whole capitalist system is all about. Trying to increase that surplus value so that the capitalists, who really don't do anything, they're able to reap these profits only because they have capital in the first place. And because the worker has nothing to sell but her or his own labor power. And Marx also pointed out that capital, that what he called the primitive capital, had to come from somewhere. It didn't just appear. The Rockefellers didn't just, somehow catch money that was falling from the skies. And he discovered that this original capital comes from very violent exploitation, violent encounters. It comes from slavery, for example. It comes from colonization. It comes from all of these historical modes of violence inflicted on indigenous people all over the world. Now, that's kind of sad. And we have to say that, we live in the United States of America. We really reap the benefits. Even those of us who are having problems now, we're in much better shape than many people are in other parts of the world. And I don't, I can't say that we should. I can say that we can and should extricate ourselves completely from the system, because we depend on it. We depend on it to produce the seats in the auditorium that we sit in order to learn about capitalism, right? But we depend on it to produce the clothes that we wear, the computers, all of these things. And therefore, in a lot of ways, we're implicated in it. We're not implicated to the same extent as, say, Bernie Madoff, who, in my opinion, is a bizarre kind of metaphor of where capitalism finds itself at this point. I mean, can you imagine what it takes to live a life like that? In which he took money from his friends and universities and charities, billions of dollars. But this could only happen in a society which so values money, so values capital, that it surpasses all values. It surpasses everything else. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the current system of capitalism and the ideologies that are associated with global capitalism. Because I'm interested in the extent to which we have lost this historical memory of capitalism. We've lost the ability to understand what it means. Even in terms of the clothes we wear, we don't necessarily know how to think about the pain that is produced in so many of the girls who manufacture in the global south the clothes that we wear every day. We tend to think of them only in terms of how much they cost. And see, that's one of the problems that capitalism produces. We think of everything in terms of its exchange value or its monetary value. Now, during the 1980s, we saw a new era in capitalism emerging. Global capitalism. The globalization of capital. Right? And now we hear talk about how wonderful it is that we live in this system of globalization where everything crosses borders. We talk about the flows of information, the fact that capital is able to move across borders at will, and information travels from one country to another, does not recognize national boundaries. And then when people start to follow those very flows, when people start to flow as well, they're called illegal immigrants. Now, something is wrong with that. Something is really wrong with that. Why can't, particularly people from countries whose local economies have been disrupted precisely because of the fact that capitalist corporations are always in search of cheaper labor markets. And factories shut down here, and they open up in Mexico. They shut down here, they open up in Korea. And then when people begin to look to the U.S. as a place where they might find a better life because their lives in their home countries have been completely disrupted, they are arrested if they're caught. Or they're treated as criminals. Now that's a contradiction we don't often talk about. What are some of the features of this new era of global capitalism? The features of what we might call neoliberalism? Now, I talked about the fact that there is supposedly now an almost total freedom of movement for capital, for goods, for services. In other words, what we're talking about is the absolute rule of the market. All over the world, public expenditures, except in a few places, I would say, public expenditures for social services have been drastically cut. Are any of you old enough to remember when there was welfare? Okay. Yeah, there used to be something we called welfare. I mean, it wasn't great. It was pretty terrible. But it was a safety net. It was a safety net for single mothers. And when did that get dismantled? Yeah, that was during the Clinton administration. I guess what I'm saying is that the Democratic Party is not the answer to everything. You know, maybe we'll have an opportunity later on to talk about how to maneuver through these contradictions. There's constant pressure for the elimination of government intervention, and if you remember, George Bush, when he did talk about the economy, was always opposed to any governmental intervention, any regulation of the market. The assumption was, leave the market. Leave the market, it will regulate itself. The market will produce the best of all possible worlds. That was, way back when Adam Smith talked about the invisible hand of the market. And look at where it got us. Privatization. The 80s, beginning in the 80s, you have an era of privatization. That is to say, the encroachment on ever larger areas of the economy to produce profit as opposed to simply producing that which human beings need in order to survive. And so, how many of you remember when healthcare wasn't privatized to the extent that it is now? When you could actually go into a hospital and get treatment without them demanding to see your HMO card first. Now, healthcare has been thoroughly commodified. It is just another commodity that has value, just like your refrigerator. It's no different. And talking about that, education. Nowadays, in a private university, $40,000 is cheap for tuition. And isn't that bizarre? I mean, if you think about it really seriously, of course we know that education costs money. But if you think about the fact that education, which really ought to be available to every human being, every child ought to have the opportunity to realize his or her own potential. Every child ought to have the opportunity to learn at a very young age that the acquisition of knowledge can be a wonderful thing. If that were the case, believe me, if that were the case, we would not have 2.3 million people behind bars today. While I'm speaking about that, I should say that we have no public mental health care system in this country. And if you look at the numbers of people in prison who have intellectual disabilities or who have been rendered mentally disabled as a result of the time they spend in prison. I was talking about privatization. Since the 80s, the system of punishment has been thoroughly corporatized and thoroughly privatized. Now, I'm not suggesting that every single corrections agency is privately owned and operated? No, not by any means, although there are many prisons that are owned and operated by companies like Corrections Corporation of America, which is the largest private prison corporation in the world, which owns and operates prisons all over the world, literally. Wackenhut, there are many other private prison corporations that are using punishment to reap profit. But I'm not only talking about that, I'm talking about the extent to which prisons and they hold now some 2.3 million people on any given day, are dependent on contracts that contracts for services, for goods. How much soap do you think 2.3 million prisoners use? So what about the contracts with the soap companies? What about the food? What about the clothes? What about the few things that they're able to have, like televisions or radios? They're whole industries whole cottage industries that have developed precisely to produce goods for people in prison. In California, for example, you're not allowed to have any kind of, say, television or radio or any kind of appliance that is not transparent. And somebody came up with this idea when, maybe you remember, when Apple produced this computer you could see through, you could see the innards, you remember that? And so somebody said, oh great, this is a perfect idea, we'll produce objects like this that can be sold to prisoners. And so California then developed a regulation that all the prisoners had to turn in all of their appliances and buy new ones from this company that makes transparent. So, you see the extent to which the punishment system is interwoven with the capitalist system, even when you don't have private prison corporations running the prisons. But there are many private prison corporations, as I was saying. As a matter of fact, if you go to Hawaii, you will discover that prisoners are disproportionately Native Hawaiian, and that makes sense. All over the world, they're disproportionately Aboriginal, disproportionately people from the global South, disproportionately black people, and in this country, of course, disproportionately black people, disproportionately Latinos. But in Hawaii, their prison overcrowdedness problem was solved by farming the prisoners out, sending them to a prison in a town called Eloy, Arizona. Now, you probably never heard of Eloy. It's a small town. And Corrections Corporation of America built a prison in Eloy, Arizona, specifically for Hawaiian prisoners. And then they began to boast about the fact that they have someone there who is an expert in Hawaiian culture, and and it goes on and on and on. And then what was interesting, I discovered last year, that right across the street from this prison that houses Hawaiian prisoners, Corrections Corporation of America was building a prison to house California prisoners. Because California's prison system is in crisis, total crisis. As a matter of fact, the situation is so bad that a federal judge, Felton Henderson, placed the whole healthcare system in the California corrections, and Arnold Schwarzenegger calls it Corrections and Rehabilitation. I don't know why he calls it rehabilitation, because there's no rehabilitation happening there. But that was one of the solutions, to ship California prisoners out to Arizona. So yeah, you see how complicated this all gets. But what is so interesting is that the very same period that saw the privatization of healthcare in general witnessed also the privatization of punishment, the privatization of prisons. As a matter of fact, the Corrections Corporation of America modeled itself after a corporation called Hospital Corporations of America. And they had an interlocking directorate. And as a matter of fact, in the very beginning, when CCA got started, it was with money that was provided by the same people who funded Kentucky Fried Chicken. And someone said, one of the people said, well, we hope to produce the same, kind of product that, KFC does. KFC produces a kind of, a chicken that it can sell all over the world, anywhere. It's the same. And they had the idea of producing prisons that they could sell on the global market all over the world. I mean, their aspirations were much vaster than their actual accomplishments. But they did manage to create prisons in places like Australia. They ran for a long time the largest women's prison in Australia until a campaign of people in Australia to force the government to retreat from the contract with CCA, change that. Now, these capitalist and neoliberal values emphasize the individual as opposed to the community. And I think it's important for all of us to look at the extent to which we have been influenced by these values. As someone who's been around for a long time, longer than most of you in the audience, much longer, I can remember a period during which people I worked with, people I was involved with in terms of campaigns to end the war in Vietnam, to free political prisoners, that they didn't think of themselves first and foremost as individuals. They thought of themselves as community, as members of communities. And I think we've lost that ability to imagine ourselves as community members, as members of communities that are often far-flung, that include people whom we don't necessarily know, whom we can't necessarily touch, but we do have emotional ties with them. We think of ourselves primarily as individuals, and as a matter of fact, neoliberal ideology assumes that people who are not able to find work are probably just lazy. I mean, things may be changing now since we are bleeding jobs, losing so many jobs. But the assumption has been for a long time that it is the individual who bears responsibility first and foremost. Neoliberal values have also persuaded us that racism has largely been overcome. As a matter of fact, until this recent election, we could not even have public conversations about race or racism. You remember Eric Holder? He said not too long ago that he thought we were a nation of cowards, precisely because we refuse to talk about race. And it has been assumed since the 80s or so that the only way to rise above racism, and this whole notion that you can rise above racism is very problematic in the first place, is by not noticing it, by not noticing race. And so we have this whole discourse of colorblindness, right? So you're supposed to pretend that you don't see race. Yeah, everybody's the same to me. And at the same time, race is one of the ways we negotiate our way through social relations in this country. Everybody knows that that's like the first thing you take note of. You may not say it, you may not acknowledge it, but you only feel comfortable when you can figure out, well, this person is Latino, this person is African American, but what is she? Right? And then there's this anxiety. If you can't figure it out, there's this, and you want to know. And sometimes you're embarrassed to ask. Sometimes you do ask, what are you anyway? You know? Other times you don't. But I mean, I mention this because we use race, as Stuart Hall, the cultural theorist, once pointed out, as a language. It's almost like a language, you know, which isn't to say that it's good or it's bad. It's just one of the ways in which we make sense of our relations in the social world. And so we get told we can't talk about it. You know, as a matter of fact, during the Obama campaign, there was that one speech he gave on race, which I think was the best speech of his entire campaign. But the problem was, I thought, you know, what a wonderful opening. What a wonderful opening to a conversation that has to become more and more complex, more and more complicated. But that speech was used to shut down discussion on race. It was used as a closure. Because the media assumed that any time an issue of race came up, it was like chaos. They didn't know what to do with it. It was like chaos reigns. Race produces chaos. Now, many people now think that we have an African American president. How could there be racism? You know? Seriously. I mean, haven't you talked to people who think that we've now been able to leap over the very last barrier, the very last racist barrier? And it's funny because, you know, in the beginning people were saying, well, you know, Obama is not really, he's not really African American. Right? It's like, what is he? He may be African, he may be American. African on one side, right? But he's not African American, right? You remember that discussion? No. But now, of course, he's the first African American president of the United States, and sort of announcing a new era. But at the same time, you know, 1 out of every 11 African Americans is under the direct control of corrections agencies. Not very long ago, the Pew Center for the States came out with a report called 1 in 31. Last year, the report was 1 in 100. You remember that? When we learned that 1 out of every 100 adults in this country is behind bars. Now, as it turns out, 1 out of every 31 adults is under the direct control of some correctional agency, whether it's a jail, a prison, parole, probation. Now, that's astounding, isn't it? I mean, that's a major crisis. And when you consider that that for black people, it's 1 in 11. But women constitute something like 10% of the imprisoned population. So for black men, it's like, I don't know, maybe there's some mathematicians in the house. You know, it would be more like 1 in 4 or something like that, right? That's scary. I mean, I don't even want to do the calculation because I don't want to even know because it's too frightening. And, okay, what is the connection between this huge number of people who are behind bars or who are under control of the criminal justice system? And let's remember, when they release these figures, 2.2, 2.3 million, that's on any given day. It's not, you know, like people come in and go out of prison all the time. So we're not talking about the same people every day. That means that the impact of imprisonment on marginalized communities is far vaster than we could possibly imagine. So what is the connection between this imprisonment rate and capitalism? Well, I think there's a direct connection. Many people assume that people are in prison just because they have committed crimes. And, you know, probably most of the people who are in prison have committed some crime. But what is crime? How do you define crime? Crime is some violation of the law, right? But then when you think about all of the people who violate the law and never go to prison, you see what I mean? You have to ask yourself, why are those who are there, why are they there? Are they there because they did what they did? Or are they there because they are subject to much more intense surveillance? Because their communities are saturated with law enforcement. And then, of course, there are those who have committed really horrendous acts. And one of the problems is we tend to imagine all of the people in prison as murderers and rapists, and that is not the case at all. You know, many of them are there because they never had a good education, because they never had opportunities, and so they get involved in illegal activity like drugs. So what would happen if we decriminalized drug use, right? I mean, it's very bizarre because nobody thinks it's that bad to have a drink of alcohol now and then. I mean, I'm not promoting marijuana, but how many people, when they drive, when they're high on marijuana, have the kinds of accidents that we know people who are drunk have? You see what I'm saying? It's not right. There's a problem there. And besides, in this country, we do not have drug programs that are accessible to people who might have addictions and who really don't want to deal with it. Why? Because they're not profitable. You know, why don't we have the kinds of schools that would track people away from prison? Because they're not profitable. You know, why don't we have the kind of recreation and the kind of housing and the kind of community activities that would create stable communities? Because it's not profitable to do that. And so we have to ask ourselves, when are we going to seriously consider the possibility of an economy that does not have to produce profit in order to provide for the human beings who live in our society? And I want to point out that since the 1980s, global capitalism, emergence of global capitalism, which meant deindustrialization of the U.S., jobs, factories moved from places like Detroit and Birmingham and all over the country to other parts of the world. People were left with no real means of sustenance. And so what do you do when you have surplus people? when you have people who don't fit in, people who can't find a job, people who can't get an education, people who are not welcomed into the educational system, what happens to them? Well, my argument is that that is precisely the work that the prison does. It becomes a garbage can. It becomes a place to deposit the refuse of society. Not only in the U.S., but increasingly all over the world. Increasingly in the global south, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, new shiny prisons are being created so that people who suffer as a result of the globalization of capital and as a result of the policies of the IMF and the World Bank, which has demanded that countries in Africa and Asia move capital to profitable sectors and away from social services, away from education. This is why prison populations are rising all over the world. So you see there's a direct relationship between the extent to which capitalism is allowed to use the resources and people to produce profits. It's very sad. It's very, very sad. And as a matter of fact, Carl Blois, who writes for the Black Commentator online, pointed out not long ago that the director of UNESCO's Global Monitoring Report, Kevin Watkins, observes, and I'm quoting, with the slowdown in growth in 2009, this is the economic crisis, we estimate that the average income of the 391 million Africans living on less than $1.25 a day will take a 20% hit. When you convert economic growth effects into human costs, the picture looks even grimmer. Best estimates point to an increase in infant mortality of somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 a year. So when you think about the damage that that does to human lives, the violence that it produces, the deaths as a direct result of the impulse of capitalism. Now, I'm looking at my timer, and I think I've been speaking about 45 minutes or so, and I would like to have a conversation with you. So, let me just point to some of the issues that I was planning to talk about in greater depth. I wanted to talk about the impact of this punishment industry on women, and not only on women who are in prison, but on women who attend institutions like this. As a matter of fact, not long ago, a couple of days ago, on Friday, I believe, there was an article in the New York Times about a case that's before the Supreme Court now, in a case that was brought by the parents of a girl in Arizona who was 13 years old. This was about 6 years ago when this incident happened in Arizona. She was I guess in 13. You're either in high school or you're in middle school, right? And so what happened was that somehow or another, the administrators thought that she had drugs. And what kind of drugs? Something like ibuprofen. And so they strip searched her. They strip searched her. They made her open her legs while she was naked. They looked between her breasts. And I point this out because this is precisely what happens to women who are in prison. The strip search, the cavity search, it's been a routine that has continued to go on and on all over the world for many, many years. And we tend to think of it, oh, this is just what happens to women, who get arrested, and, men too. But for women, it has a different meaning because it's sexual assault. It's often experienced as sexual assault. And for many of the women who go to prison, they've already experienced sexual assault in a different context with an individual person. And then now they learn that actually the state can be a perpetrator of sexual assault. The government can commit sexual assault. So I would like us to think about, not only these issues, but how they are interconnected. And I wanted to point to the fact that as we are involved in these struggles for freedom, and it's always about struggles to expand the terrain of freedom, the terrain of justice. We learn that justice is far more capacious than we ever thought. We may begin by fighting for the right to vote on behalf of African Americans, and we may recognize that it's not only about that, it's about citizenship rights for immigrants, and I'm talking about not legal citizenship rights, I'm talking about global citizenship rights. We learn that we struggle for the equality of women, and we begin to think about gender issues, right? But then we recognize that we can't stop there because we've been under the assumption that gender is binary and is only about men and women, and we learn about transgender, people who identify as transgender, and therefore, or perhaps gender nonconforming, either as trans or gender nonconforming or intersex, and we begin to recognize that it gets more and more complicated, it gets larger and larger, and that's very exciting. Many people become anxious because they want to keep it manageable, right? And people who struggle for civil rights, they said, well, we don't want civil rights to be tainted by talking about marriage in LGBT communities, because that's not the same kind of civil right. You see what I'm saying? But then there were those who said they didn't want democracy to be tainted by having black people who were intellectually inferior participate in the voting process. So we have to be careful of replicating the very arguments that were used against us when we achieve a particular victory. And we have to allow ourselves to be open, and our vocabularies have to change. And one of the things that I like to point out is that older people sometimes get upset when younger people take certain kinds of things for granted. Don't you know what we had to go through? Don't you know all of you have heard that, right? However old you are, I heard it from my parents, right? But in a sense, it's actually good that we don't have to know all of that. I mean, we nod to it, but each time we're able to win victories that create a new terrain of struggle, there are things that younger generations can take for granted, and precisely because they can take it for granted, they can take us somewhere else. You see, and they produce more capacious meanings of freedom. Freedom is access to resources and materials and trajectories that make it possible to fashion lives and fashion communities and fashion futures. So I would like to conclude by reading a quote, a passage from a speech that W.E.B. Du Bois made in 1946 at a conference of the Southern Negro Youth Congress in Columbia, South Carolina. Are any of you familiar with the Southern Negro Youth Congress? Yeah, a couple of people. Some of you may have seen The Great Debaters. You remember Melvin Tolson. You remember the character Denzel Washington played, and he was out there organizing with white and black tenant farmers. They didn't tell you that that was a Southern Negro Youth Congress. And the reason they don't want you to know about this organization is because there were communists who were in the organization. You remember how he got accused of being a communist in the film? Yeah, my mother wasn't a communist, but she was a member of the Southern Negro Youth Congress. And we don't realize the extent to which we are standing on their shoulders. And so this is what Du Bois said on that day. That's my timer. It says timer done. So I am going to read you this quote, this passage. There could be no more splendid beckoning to the youth of the 20th century after the flat failures of late civilization, after the flamboyant establishment of an industrial system which creates poverty and the children of poverty, which are ignorance and disease and crime, after the crazy boasting of a white culture that finally ended in wars which ruined civilization in the whole world, in the midst of allied people who have yelled about democracy and never practiced it, either in the British Empire or in the American Commonwealth or in South Carolina. Here is the chance, Du Bois said, for young women and young men of devotion to lift again the banner of humanity and to walk toward a situation which will be free and intelligent, which will be healthy and unafraid, and build in the world a culture led by black folk and joined by people of all colors and all races, without poverty, without ignorance, without disease. Thank you very much.